Do we have souls? What is a soul? Is there any good evidence for the existence of a soul? These are the questions I'm going to be answering in this edition of Ask an Atheist. For anyone new to my channel, I'm Secular Spirit, and the reason I wanted to talk about the soul is because it's such a fundamentally important concept in so many religions around the world. The idea of a soul has existed throughout human history, and it's very prevalent in pretty much any culture. But before we go any further into the discussion, I think it's important that we define what a soul is. There's a lot of varying definitions out there, but the rough consensus seems to be about three different things. 1, that the soul is our essence. 2, that the soul is non-physical. And 3, that the soul survives the body after death. So if you ask me personally, do I believe that we have souls? My answer is I don't know. It's possible, but I'm not convinced by any of the evidence out there for the existence of a soul. So let's take a quick look at the evidence that's around for the existence of a soul. While most people who claim that there is a soul believe that it is non-physical, there have been some attempts over the centuries to prove that the soul actually is a physical thing that you can weigh and measure and point to. One of the most famous examples of this is from the early 1900s when American doctor Duncan McDougall attempted to weigh several terminally ill patients to prove that there is a weight difference that happens at the point of death. At the end of the experiment, McDougall determined that the weight of the soul was 21 grams, and he based this on findings from one of his patients. In a very unscientific move, he found conflicting results in other patients and basically just discarded those. But even though that study was very flawed, the idea that the soul weighed 21 grams became very popular in subsequent years, and it became something of an urban legend. Even today, some people still believe that the soul weighs 21 grams. But unfortunately, there isn't any real good evidence for this, and as far as I could tell, I couldn't find any examples of good studies that show that the soul has a physical weight. But as we've already discussed, most people don't believe that the soul is a physical thing. Most of the arguments for the existence of a soul are grounded in this intuition that there's more to us than our physical bodies. When talking about evidence for a soul, people believe that there's this intrinsic essence to us. It's something that we don't need scientific proof for, nor do we need to rely on blind faith to prove that it's real. We know it's there because we know we exist. We exist, and so therefore our souls exist. Of course, the problem with our intuitions is that they can often be misleading. If we just look back into human history, people believed in all sorts of gods and demons and witches. And if you just think about the simple example of having this intuition or gut feeling that someone loves you, and then it turns out that they don't. So in that sense, we can't always rely on our intuition, our gut feelings. They can fail us. But it's hard to resist this feeling that there is more to us than our physical bodies. If we just look at our feelings, our thoughts, even just the sensation of pain, there's no physical way to describe them. There's no place where we can point and say that's where that thought is, that's where that feeling is. It feels like there's something separate between the consciousness and the physical body. But if we look at the scientific research in this area in recent years, it seems like the evidence is pointing towards the opposite direction, that our belief that the consciousness and the physical body are two separate things may indeed just be an illusion. Although there's nothing conclusive yet, obviously, research seems to be showing that our consciousness and even our feeling that our consciousness is separate from our physical body is really dependent on our physical body. Just to give you a few examples, when we look at people who have suffered traumatic brain injuries, one of the most common consequences of these injuries is an increase in aggression and moodiness and depression in those people. And then think of people with dementia who experience drastic and maybe even complete memory loss. When those people's personalities completely and drastically change, are their souls still safely in there somewhere, intact and preserved, kind of like how you can reboot a computer to go back to a certain state? Is that how it works with us? It seems to me that who we think we are, our essence if you will, is completely dependent on these physical changes in our body. When our bodies change, when our brains change, we change. And it seems far-fetched to think that there's some sort of unchanged essence within us that isn't impacted by the physical changes in our bodies. One example that I found particularly fascinating was that of split brain patients. So these are people who have had the left and right hemispheres of their brains severed completely. And researchers have made some startling discoveries when studying these split brain patients. In his book, The Ethical Brain, researcher Michael Gazzaniga writes, "Experiments on split brain patients reveal how readily the left brain interpreter can make up stories and beliefs. In one experiment, for example, when the word walk was presented only to the right side of a patient's brain, he got up and started walking. When he was asked why he did this, the left brain, where language is stored and where the word walk was not presented, quickly created a reason for the action. I wanted to go get a Coke. That side of the brain just completely fabricated this reason for this action. In that sense, it appears that the left and right hemispheres of the brain can act independently from each other in certain ways. Of course, there still needs to be a lot of research done in this area, but these early discoveries seem to just shatter a whole traditional notion of each one of us having a soul. But then people who believe in a soul, and especially theists, will point to all of the near-death experiences that have been reported, also seemingly throughout human history, and they'll say, look at that, doesn't that prove that there is something that transcends and that is beyond the human body? How can we explain how often these experiences are talked about, and how there's all of these similarities in these near-death experiences? People talk about seeing a white light, or even of angels, or even sensing the presence or of seeing God, actually. Some theists will point to how there are peer-reviewed studies looking into this near-death experience phenomenon, and there's a lot of books that have been published to popularize this idea, famous examples being Heaven is for Real and The Boy Who Came Back from Heaven, which are supposedly first-hand accounts from young children who claim to have visited heaven. Now, here's my problem with these reports on near-death experiences. They're reliant on people who often might be biased to want to believe that there is something after death, or who might follow a religion and want to find some way of proving that the religion is true. And from those two books I mentioned as famous examples, Alex Malarkey, the boy whose account is written in The Boy Who Came Back from Heaven, actually retracted his claim and said that he made it all up. But beyond the cases that are just intentional fabrications, whether for fame or attention or whatever, we have to consider the fact that we as human beings are capable of deceiving ourselves. Think about the example I mentioned earlier of the left side of the brain coming up with a reason for why they took a walk, because I wanted to get a Coke. I think in the same way, when we're in a traumatic experience where we are close to death, have gone through a horrible injury or something, our brains try to fill in the gaps of what's happening to us. So while it's possible that nothing actually happened in our near-death experience, we might have dreams, we might hallucinate, we might misremember things or add things that weren't actually there, but we convince ourselves that they actually happened. Not intentionally, but somewhere from deep within us, from our supposed soul essence, if you will. And if you're born and raised in a culture where there's ideas like the white light, or angels, or whatever it happens to be, I don't think it's that surprising that people will then report that those things are what happened to them at the point of their near-death experience. In a nutshell, what I'm saying is I don't find that evidence very convincing, but perhaps we'll get more evidence in the future and my opinion and belief will change. But until then, I'm not going to believe that we have souls based on such weak, flawed evidence. But before I end this video, I want to address something that theists might say. What's the harm in believing in a soul even though we don't know for sure that we have one? Why can't we just believe it on faith and enjoy the good things that come from that belief? Well, first of all, I think there's a lot of danger that comes with believing in things or having wishful thinking about things just because they make us feel better. It detaches us from reality and can open the door to believing in a lot of other things that we don't have good evidence for just because they make us feel good, because they comfort us. And that's a very dangerous thing to do. But in the case of the soul, I want to just mention two things that I think are potentially harmful about the belief in a soul. Number one, the belief that we have souls also leads to the belief that there's more to this life than what we can see and experience, that life doesn't end after death. We continue to exist in some form. And my concern is that that takes away the importance and emphasis on this one life, which is the only thing that we know we have for sure. Wouldn't it be such a shame if we wasted our lives or didn't do all the things we wanted to do because we had this belief that we'll just continue on in some other life or in this afterlife? And number two, and this is the really toxic one, a belief in a soul is tied to these really harmful notions of good and evil that exist within us. It encourages this idea that when someone is a bad person, that there's something about their essence that is bad or rotten or evil or whatever, and it changes the way we look at people. Of course, this can have problems in the opposite direction too, where we think someone is good to their core and pure when they're really just a flawed person that does some good things and does some bad things. The really destructive thing is when people are punished because other people believe that they have evil souls, when in reality we can explain the problems with them in purely physical terms. One of the best examples of this is of psychopaths, and we want to demonize those people. But studies have shown that psychopaths lack connections in their brain between the parts that are responsible for empathy and guilt and the other parts of the brain that are responsible for fear and anxiety. When someone is a remorseless psychopathic killer, it could just be because they have faulty wiring in their brain, not because they're an evil person with an evil soul. And another example that's always troubled me is that of former American football player Aaron Hernandez. So as a football player, Aaron Hernandez experienced multiple blows to the brain over the course of his life. And so when he killed someone and then took his own life in prison when he was convicted of that murder, when researchers studied his brain, they found that he had a very advanced case of CTE, which is a brain disease, at the age of 27. And CTE has been linked with mood disorders, aggression, depression, all sorts of destructive behaviors. So how much of Aaron Hernandez's actions were because he was a bad person, and how much of it is because he was suffering from CTE, from physical changes to his brain? So that's where we get into trouble when we start believing in souls, in essences, in this sort of way. It encourages us to demonize people, and it takes away the emphasis from the only life that we know we have for sure. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you have any questions for me, just leave them in the comments. And if you haven't already, I'd really appreciate it if you can like this video and subscribe to my channel. And I'll be back with another video soon.